Hey everyone, if you're a fan of the show, please head over to mikeyop.com and click the subscribe button. It's the best way to support us, and it's free. That's MIKEYOPP.com. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Mike Oppenheim, and you're listening to Coffin Talk, Exit Interviews with the Living, a weekly podcast that explores how our views on death affect the way we live our life. This week, from Phoenix, Arizona, I am lucky to have Mr. Dave Pilar on the podcast, and Dave is a former retired pastor and a currently full-time therapist, and we met a few years ago at a coffee shop that we both went to, and we would have incredible conversations, so we're going to have another one today. So welcome to the show. Dave, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing really well, and it's so good to hear your voice again. It's been quite a while.
Yeah, it has, and I'm excited to get into metaphysics, but first I thought it would be funny to let our listeners know that we met through this coffee shop, but it's because it was next door to the actual church you were the minister of. So do you want to get into that a little bit?
Oh, yeah. It was that we were in a little shopping mall. We call them strip malls out here, and I would go there every morning and found you typing away many, many mornings, and it looked like you were very absorbed into some deep intellectual work there. And so I don't know who started the conversation, but I was interested in what you were doing, and then one thing led to another, and it didn't take long before we started getting into deep waters. I really appreciated a conversation partner, finding one like you, because it's really easy to live in a bubble when you're in a church, and it's sort of an echo chamber, and you have a very different perspective on things, and I just loved it. And that was the beginning.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one of the reasons you were a must-have guest on this show is that, likewise, you are a jack of all trades, and you literally have advanced degrees in so many different things that I would have thought previous to meeting you would contradict each other. So I would never have a thought, growing up at least, that I would meet someone who could both be a Christian pastor and a therapist, because I would think of the two things as somewhat contradictory. But today we're going to get to the bottom of all that. So I guess the best place to start before we get into your philosophy as a person would be what got you into Christianity and becoming a pastor? How did that work out in your life?
Well, it's interesting because the interest in psychology and spiritual faith or experience was hand in hand. I was something of a lost young man, and in my mid-20s, and really sort of in an identity flux, didn't know what my life was about, and, who I really was, and that kind of thing. And encountered by chance a pastor who just took a keen interest in me. And again, similar to our conversations, just started talking about the philosophical things of life, and that opened up a dimension I really didn't know I had until it was illuminated. And so I sort of found I found some faith and a higher purpose. I found a unifying perspective or lens on life and death and the purpose of life through the Christian faith. And I just felt compelled to, as we say in the biz, I eventually or soon after felt a call to ministry, to devote my life to those things. But a lot of it, when I look back in hindsight, was also trying to understand what was happening to me. So it was sort of a transformation of identity. And I very quickly became interested in psychology and sociology and anthropology, just trying to explain things through a broader human experience, universal experience. and really the inner experience. And that's where the spirituality comes in.
Okay, great. I'm going to ask you for sure 3 to 4 different questions based on that answer. Before I ask those, I'm just going to try to nip the life story in the bud with which came first then, the degree in ministry or the degree in psychology?
It was a degree in theology, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so at what age were you both a minister and is therapist the right term?
Yeah, what happened was I quickly realized that I was more interested in doing not a conventional ministry, but one that dealt with people's transformation from a therapist point of view. So I began to focus on, I really thought of it as a specialty as pastoral counseling. And so after a few years, after seminary, after a couple of years in a church in the Midwest, I came out to Phoenix, my wife and I, and 2 children. And at that time, we eventually had 3, a third one here. But I started a postgraduate residency in marriage and family therapy and pastoral counseling. And it took me several years to earn that degree and licensure in Arizona as a therapist.
So at a certain point in your life, you were a young family man with children working with family counseling. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
And the irony was not lost on you based on the conversations I've had with you. So what did you start to see with this inner life that you're talking about? Can you relate that to this part of your life?
Yeah, it was the kind of it was an interest in understanding transformation, how people go from one level to another, how we experience just the spiritual language was that helps explain it as a higher consciousness. How does a middle-aged child become an adolescent? And for example, how does an adolescent become an adult? The things that adults think about and the things they understand are not possible for children and adolescents. They're at a different developmental stage, and they just can't see things at a higher stage of consciousness. And so this was sort of like an intuitive hunger, a kind of a deeper experience, deeper than words can tell. That when that what I had experienced in my life, and what I felt and heard and saw reflected in faith and scripture, were pointing to these things. And what I later realized was more of the mystical core of religion, or some people just say spirituality. But this mystical inner experience, very deep, intuitive, beyond cognitive logic. It doesn't mean it's not reasonable. It has to be reasonable, but it's at a different level of understanding.
So to what extent do you think the world is using religion to work out this internal intuitive process versus religion is a structure for society to stop people from doing bad things? Like, where do you stand in between those two completely opposite?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I guess I would say that every major religion, every deep religious tradition that stands the test of time is rooted in a deeper spiritual, mystical experience and guidance into transformation, into higher levels of consciousness and experience. But they all start at a lower developmental level. You don't as you already know that you don't let small children make any choice they want. you have to give them guidelines, and so there's a lot of moral training that goes on in religion, structured religion, and at some point though it begins to develop into the formation of the heart or the character, and the idea that the lower level God, the divine God, wants conformity, obedience. That's like at the level of a child. And then as a person evolves, they realize, well, no, just like myself, I don't want people to treat me well because they have to. I want people to treat me well because they value me. I don't want people to treat me well because they love me or they find me a person of worth. And so it begins to move towards a relational experience, not transactional. Transactional is you do A, I give you B. You follow the commandments, God rewards you. It's a good place to start, but it cannot sustain the deeper longing and the really depth of the human capacity to love and be loved. So eventually it has to give way into, what we were talking about earlier, this mystical experience, the sense of being interconnected, and the experience of love and compassion and kindness. And really, to me, it's more of a unitive experience, as the mystical tradition would say in all religions. It's more of a unity with God, unity with all people, unity even with the created world, versus this separateness, a separate self moving about with other separate selves. So yeah, I think a lot of embedded in your question is, a realization that a lot of times religion doesn't really promote this deeper inner experience. We might say more transcendent experience. It's pretty parochial. It can be rather confining. And I've come to the sense that organized religion, most of our experiences of it anyway, are more like a scaffolding. It has to give way to the thing that's being formed.
Wow. So it's almost as if, it's weird because you're creating like a double analogy. You're talking about the evolution of a child into an adult, and then you're talking about the evolution of a religious person into a non-religious person who's actually more religious than the religious person. Because, so yeah, that's incredible. It's very hard for me to not agree with that. That's like a pretty, just based on my life experience.
Yeah, it's pretty paradoxical, right? But I used to try to remind people that Jesus was pretty revolutionary. He got killed for it. And embedded in the unitive experience of faith is the acceptance and unity with all people, really all of life. And when you get to that level, possession, ownership, tribal identity, national identity, religious identity fades into the background, and that can be pretty threatening to social structures.
So let me ask you a personal question, but it's far enough removed that you can answer it without worrying about how it comes across. So I know you have 3 children, and I've met all of them, and they're awesome. And then but I haven't met your grandchild, and so this question is about that person, because I'm just curious: would you want them to start off with religion, or would you want them to start off without religion based on your life experience? So it's a very direct question to you. And if you don't want to use that real person, but yeah.
No, that's fine. No, it's a wonderful question. I actually would. I would want them to start off in an organized religion, in a what we call perennial religions, like the ones that stand the test of time, because it really is a scaffolding, and it really forms the character, and if transformation, the one thing spirituality is about experiences, what we know intuitively. And the one thing I know, and I think we all know, is that life is a journey, a developmental progression. And so it's sort of like, we tell parents and, therapy-wise that, a permissive, laissez-faire parent can be as damaging and neglectful in their neglect as a harsh, abusive parent. And so we really need that kind of structure. But I would want to be there. I would want to be a sort of, a guide in the bushes to keep whispering things that awaken his deeper sense of self and his soul. That it's more than just obedience, more than just conformity, more than just zealousness. And because I think that's really the deeper voice of love, of the divine that calls us, from each stage to the next and even beyond.
So in your career as a minister, as a pastor, did it ever happen that someone came to you and said, I've outgrown the scaffold, and if that happened, how did you respond to that? Since you kind of have it's not hypocritical based on knowing you and talking to you, but it would seem hypocritical for a pastor to tell someone, yes, you're correct, it is a scaffold, please leave.
Yeah, and it's really important to make a distinction, and I always would in those conversations, is that the organized form of a religion is different than the core of the faith, and so I wouldn't, I would encourage people, and the way those conversations would go would be, people would be referring to they just can't breathe in what I call the American Protestant church. They can't breathe. They don't feel that they have affinity anymore. They don't feel doubt and exploration is actually frowned upon. As long as you do it within the lines, yes, it's wonderful. It's accepted and applauded. But when you begin to question the structures of what I would call dogma, then you're going to experience alienation. So I'd always encourage people to validate that you're suffocating, and you have to listen to your spirit, your soul, but encourage them to keep following it. not just take a jettison into nihilism or something like that.
So I want to use the rest of our time more productively for our audience, because I feel like you're someone who's helped me, and I've seen you help other people, and I've seen why you're able to help people, and it's because you are this walking series of non-contradictions that seem contradictory. You are a passionate man of religion, and you're also a passionate man of science and psychology. And then you're also just like interesting and normal, and you can kick back and hang out. So
that's reassuring, actually.
How do you cope with it all, with the stress of it all? Like before COVID, even before, the politics gone hyperbolic in 2016, like how just throughout the course of your life have you managed to keep yourself together when you have so many different opinions that seem contradictory, but again, probably aren't? To make it more succinct, I could also just say, what's your faith?
What's my faith? The core of it is trust. um, trust in you know, the love that is personal, the love that is not private but personal, that we all are bound to, and trust that we're all bound together, and that this is rather obscure, but it's coming to mind. Sorry. Julia of Norwich, a mystic, Catholic mystic from Spain in, like, I think the 16th century. In one of her meditative, prayerful experiences, received a message, so to speak, that all is well, all manner of things will be well. That there's a bigger purpose, and the organizing fabric of love that we call divine or God, that keeps this all together. So going back to your question, I haven't dealt well sometimes, and to be quite honest, my disappointment and grief over the American church, I couldn't cope. It felt like at times. That was very difficult. But then again, I've got to go back to the core of the transformative experiences that occurred way back years ago, when I first realized I was actually spiritual, as we all are. That transformation is all about dying to an old order and rising to a new, dying to self, or as I like to say, dying to our small self, our ego self, and rising to our transcendent self, the big self, or like Buddhism says, big mind. So it's, the struggle, the pain, the resistance, the anger, all those things are part of it. Really the fuel of the for the crucible, for the heat.
Yeah. The rate of atheism is not rising, and it's actually declining worldwide, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that there's a rise in organized religion. There's not. Like, what is your advice for much, much younger people than you and I, who are like struggling with this awakening of like, wait, the scaffold is a scaffold?
Ooh, that's really interesting, because one of the factors here is that it's really hard to be spiritual in this time. But one of the reasons it's also good news, because there's a lot of people have written about this, that there's a shift of world consciousness happening, and we've moved from a sort of like Enlightenment modern age into the postmodern age, this where everything's kind of falling apart, and people lament that there's no absolutes anymore. But what I see there, and what more of a spiritual or mystical lens would say is, the old separate, tribal, ego-driven, individualistic consciousness of the Western Enlightenment is falling apart. And what's emerging in its place, or being birthed from it, is more of a unitive, interconnected sense. So, for example, why is it that so many young people under 30, are so passionate about the global warming and our planet? Well, it's because they have the seeds of a different consciousness that old people like me weren't given, and that is interconnectedness. We're all related. And so, to me, the core of Christianity is pointing to all things being summed up in the love of God. Buddhism talks about that. Islam talks about that. But Hinduism talks about that. This sense that the Christianity would call the reborn person, or the transformed person, or the resurrected person, even in this life, realizes that we're all bound in God. The enlightened person, the awakened person, realizes that we're all part of the whole. And so, I would encourage people, young people, to cultivate that and to deepen that experience. And the challenge is, what form of spirituality does that take now? What communal form? What, are there any organized forms of that? Those are pretty hard to find.
And so now that you've virtually answered every metaphysical question I could throw at you, except the final one, I would like to hear your thoughts. And I think we might go a little over on this, so please take your time and think it through. I don't want you to rush this at all, because I really am yearning to hear your answer to this. What do you think specifically happens to you when you die? Like, what is your envisionment? And I feel very comfortable asking you this, because you're a little older than me, but you're not like at the stage yet where it's really knocking on your door. So how do you stand with all that?
So I would say, I don't know. But it depends on when you ask. So one of the things that I was, I knew you'd ask that question. I was thinking, one of the things that generated my interest in spirituality way back when was I was afraid to die. And at least I was aware of that. And one of the, some of the notable points in my spiritual life were being around people that were dying. And I used to dread, I spent a stint as a chaplain, hospital chaplain too. And even as a pastor, whenever you get that call, someone is dying, someone is terminally ill, whatever, and I would just dread having to go into that space. I found a lot of people were very afraid, and they struggled and fought, and they're anxious, and it's tough. It's ugly. And then I experienced those individuals that went through a kind of transformation this side of the veil of death. And I really mean this literally. There were some people that I saw that literally had an illumination. I don't know how to explain it. And, I don't know if it was my brain playing tricks on me, but they were so filled with love and so free from their ego that when it doesn't matter who walked in the room, the nurse, the medical supply guy, they beamed with love and connection. And so one of the things that struck me was the desire to learn to die well, and to be able to trust and not fear, not be anxious, because this from conversations in the past, but I was a pretty anxious person, especially I had a healthy dose of social anxiety. I realize that's really rooted in our fear of our death, or rather our ego's fear of death. And this sense and a spiritual experience that there's a part of us, a deeper or more transcendent, whichever direction you like, that is, it transcends that it realizes that it's not the end. And so, really the purpose of, I think, the spiritual life is is to practice dying. And anybody that's been tried to meditate recognizes that there's the active form of their mind, which I would call the ego, that just won't shut up, and it will not let go. It does not want to let go. And neuroscientists tell us that is part of our what they call our default mode network. It's kind of part of our survival network, and it's the reptile brain, mammalian brain. All it's worried about is survival, and it's binary. It's. I tell people that their reptile brain's pretty stupid. It just knows yes, no, either or, safe, unsafe, eat, be eaten, pleasure, pain, and basically what we call our identity is that inner tape, that inner dialogue that constantly is playing with us as the center subject, the main character. It's always assessing risk, threat, defensiveness, pleasure, cravings. It never stops wanting, and it never stops trying to be in control. And so, so if any kind of prayer or spiritual experience or even meditation, it's sort of a practice of dying to that small self. And of course, when you do, you realize that there's something else there. There's something else in there. And so there's this sort of like disidentification. It's sort of like loosening the grip that my ego has on me, and I realize that I'm not my thoughts. I'm not all these reactionary feelings that go on. And guy cuts me off on the road, and that's really not me. That's just that default mode network, my ego constantly chattering. And so, a long-winded way to answer the question is that I think what happens when you die is that you experience in kind of a turbo fashion, kind of this letting go, this deep release, this acceptance that this is the way of life, and death is another stage, and transition into something higher.
That's absolutely beautiful. I want to end the podcast on that note because that was too perfect. Anything I ask will just diminish from that. So, Mr. Dave Pilar, thank you so much for helping us put another nail in the coffin. Once again, everyone, I am Mike Oppenheim, and you've been listening to Coffin Talk, exit interviews with the living, and we'll see you soon. Walking along when I hear